lifted. Let's get lifted. Let's get lifted. Let's get lifted. Let's get lifted on these ABCs. 1, 2, 3s. Take a look inside. Everything you need is right in front of you. Right in front of you on these ABCs. Thank you for joining Amplafii Genius Productions and my grandmother, Frances Ellison-Dansby. My maternal grandmother, who is our first interviewee on our series of community interviews. And I hope you will enjoy her story as she shares with us some of the highlights and moments she remembers in her childhood, in her adulthood. She's a remarkable woman, and I'm glad to be able to share this story with you. So stay tuned, and more will come. But first, Frances Ellison-Dansby.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me.
Yes. So we're gonna go to where you were born, how you were born, what you remember of your childhood.
Okay. I was born in Atlanta, Georgia. On Smith Street, Southwest, which is in the Pittsburgh community.
Okay.
And
Which is still there. The
house
house is still there?
No, that house is not there. But it was on Smith Street, and it was the home of my maternal great-grandmother and father, Carrie Young Idlet and Theodore Idlet. I was delivered by a midwife.
Okay.
Her name was Bill Scott.
And she
was the midwife for many in the community.
Okay.
And lived on the next street over from us in the upper block.
Of Pittsburgh.
Oh,
wow.
Bill Scott. Bill Scott was a very, very skilled. Mm-hmm. And I say skilled because as I grew up and was able to interact with different women in the community, I always like to look at Miss Scott's hands because her hands were so strong. And when she touched you, you knew she was touching you.
Wow.
But she was also she had children of her own.
Oh.
She had her son was named Virgil Scott, and many of people who lived in Atlanta know Virgil because he was an eloquent speaker.
Okay.
And very, very gregarious. He attended Clark College, and I remember that because he was about maybe 7 years older than I. Okay. And we all grew up in the community too. Okay. Because he went to Ariel Bowen United Methodist Church.
Okay.
And my family did too. Mm-hmm. And while we're on that, my great-grandparents' home was the home for my mother, my father, and my maternal grandmother, and my maternal grandmother's brother, and my cousins, my second cousins. Well, it was home for many people because it was well constructed, had plenty of space in it, but did not have an indoor toilet for a long time.
Oh, right.
But it was a house that had steps, about 10 or 15 steps from the sidewalk. And the front porch ran the width of the house. And the porch railings were all wood. And there were concrete flower pots going that way. You went down the steps at 2 different levels.
Oh.
And I know that because my sister and my sister who was 18 months younger than I, we used to sit on those steps and play up and down the steps when my great grandparents were outside on the sidewalk, so they could catch us if we were coming on fall down.
Oh.
But anyway, this house had what was called at that time an anteroom. It was an interim space.
Okay. Anteroom.
An anteroom. And in that room was a hat rack, which is a place where you hang your hats. There was a mirror on the hat rack, and there was a place for shoes down in the bottom that had a deck to it. Now, the most interesting thing about that hat rack was, as my sister and I grew up being toddlers, my great grandfather,
whose name was what again?
Theodore.
And y'all called him?
We called him Daddy.
We called him Daddy. Okay.
We called him Daddy. But he made two little seats on each side of the inside of the bottom drawer of that hat rack, and the little seats that we could climb in and sit down, and then he put a board across it that was cut out so our little bodies could sit inside to either eat or play.
Oh, wow.
And
on the hat rack.
In the hat rack.
In the hat
rack. And as I said, there was a mirror in this hat rack, and it ran the length of the hat rack with the hangers on it, the fixed hangers. Anyhow,
and he built that himself.
Yeah, well, he was very creative. He was very creative and was a master carpenter. Now you think about when I'm talking about, he was a master carpenter.
Because you were born in what year?
1935. 1935, and they had lived in that house, I understand, for more than 10 years before my birth. And my mother continued to use that as a base for, well, it was her home, and then she went to Fort Valley College.
Okay. Your mother.
My mother.
Okay.
My mother, and that's why we grew up in my maternal grandparents' house, because that was the family home. And growing up on that street where everybody knew each other, most of them were the owners of the home, where they were buying the homes that they were in, or owners already of the houses that they lived in. And we had a seamstress, we had a barber.
In the community.
On this particular street, on Smith Street. Wow. We had men who worked at Southern Railroad. We had a section of the Lutheran Church, which still sits on, it's Abernathy now, but it used to be West End. And then at the corner of the street was Ariel Bourne. And the people who lived on the supporting two streets that intersected at either Mary and Smith and Mary and our many of them just walked to that church. That was the community, that particular church. Although there were other churches in the area, Baptist, Lutheran, Episcopalian. What was that? I think essentially that was it. Baptist and Episcopalians and Methodists at that time. Most of the people knew each other.
So would y'all borrow cups of sugar and eggs and?
They borrowed.
Okay.
The most significant thing to me is the house on Smith Street had a large backyard, which had a fence about a 20 feet from the entrance of the from the back porch entrance.
Yeah.
There was a black back porch on this house, and the people on that street, I would imagine about 10 families, would pool their resources, buy a pig.
Oh, a pig!
And then they all contributed to the fattening up of that pig until it was a hog.
Okay.
And,
so they would feed the pig.
Everybody, they take their table scraps or whatever they knew was going to produce a healthy hog. And they all cooperated in feeding the pig until it became a hog. And then,
but where would it live?
It lived in a pig pen. That was a little pig. They had that was a pig pen on the left side of the backyard, along with a chicken coop.
How many chickens did you have?
Well, I remember a red Long Island red chicken.
Okay.
A guinea hen. A bot rock, and I never did find out how you spell that, but it had black feathers.
Okay.
There was a red feathered chicken and the little guinea hen, which to me looks like what we call our Cornish hen.
Okay.
But it was a guinea.
Okay.
A guinea.
Okay.
Okay. And we helped my great grandpa feed the chickens, but chickens also are territorial.
Yeah, okay.
And so sometimes you had to run from them.
Oh, goodness. The attack of the chickens.
When we were children. But anyway, they all cooperated in fattening the piglet.
Okay.
And then they had the hog killing in January, usually in January because it was cold. And they had
And why is it better to do it when it's cold?
Because it preserves
the meat.
The meat.
Okay.
And it's the process is really interesting.
Okay.
And what they did was that I could remember. I never did actually see them knock the hog in the head with an axe, but I remember that part. And then I remember they graduated to shooting it with the rifle, shooting as times became more modern. I guess. Anyhow, the men would all kill the hog, skin the hog, and gut it. It would be they'd hang it on a tripod, and let the blood soak from that pig. And then when it had all the blood had drained from it, they washed it with buckets of water because they didn't have too many hoses back then. Eventually they did have hoses, but the men all cleaned them. And it's interesting to see how the skin of a dead hog looks after they scrape the hair off of it. And some of them had their little devices they had made that scraped, but some of them used rocks. And
rocks to scrape the hair.
They screamed. They cut the hair off, and then they cleaned it, and they cleaned it inside and out, and all of the entrails, every bit of the hog was used for food. And some of the people in the neighborhood that were participants and were sharing in the hog, some of them wanted the intestines, which were kidneys, and they would clean them. And the other women would help. Sometimes the men would help, but they cleaned those. The liver, pork liver, liver. They now I did see the entrails coming out sometimes. They would come, but it was just an adventure to me. I didn't realize that I could toot my nose up until I was a little older. However.
What you mean, toot your nose up?
Because there's a smell for when you doing all of this. Well, I remember once it was very, very cold and it was raining outside. And it was the day of the hog killing. And there was a little piglet that they had already purchased, and somebody had brought him and put him in the little pen where he got out of the pen. And as he ran around the yard, and the men tried to catch that piglet, slipping and sliding in the cold, slippery mud. It was a sight to behold.
Oh.
And of course, as children, we were laughing because just to see the men slip and slide. But they did eventually catch the piglet, and then they could go on killing the hog. What happened?
The pig was like, I am not signing up for this.
What the house on Smith Street was about maybe 6 or 7 feet off the ground. It had rock foundation.
Okay.
It was, and in that, underneath that house, they had it was a curing hole. It was dug. It was about 4 feet.
Mm-hmm.
It was about a 4 feet hole, and for that our family, maybe about a 7 by 4 foot hole on the house. But they put rocks in the bottom of that hole in the ground. They salted the meat that our family was going to keep. Everybody else had whichever ways at their houses, and some people who didn't have a lot of space, where space was used and the names were kept, so people it would begin to that they would cure, and they salted the hams and the back, and that has a name, but I can't remember what you call that part. But the part, everybody got a part of that hog based on what they had agreed to in the beginning. And if there was something that somebody, maybe some family had reduced the size, then they shared the overage with other people. But they had meat which was cured. That's what you call curing the meat. Like hams now that you might, most people get the ham. The favorite ham now is
honey baked. What?
Honey baked, and that's just honey and salt and all sugar, wrapped, and then they wrapped them in cheesecloth. Or if they didn't have the parts of the hogs that you got, but if they didn't have cheesecloth, the flour and the meal, sugar came in these sacks, in different size sacks, and men in my family, my great grandmother they kept them in huge cans, maybe about 2 feet tall, and about a foot in diameter. But they wrapped the hams to go in the ground, and the meat was not on the ground. They had other fabrics and grass that I think was in the bottom of the pits, but they wrapped the food, the meat, and there was a time frame for staying down there, and then in another part of this curing place
underneath the
house, they hung some of the hams up on poles in these claws. The hams, I think most of the hams were hanging up, and then they had other means of keeping them, insects and things out, and that's where they preserve their food.
Wow.
We also had a garden in that backyard. We had most of the turnip greens.
Okay.
And we did have some collards. Now there was some people on the street had string beans. We did have some string beans and potatoes in the backyard. In the little, you had a meal in your garden,
right?
And then you had eggs, from the chicken.
From the
and
chicken.
then you had chicken.
Yes.
And the chickens. Now, I did see my great granddaddy ring the chicken neck one time, and I got so upset and sad. So I didn't see that anymore. He started chopping, pulling the neck, putting it over a rock or something, and just chopping it off quick. But then the chicken's body would just wriggle around the yard. So they stopped letting us watch that because they saw we were getting too upset about it. But I just want to say that now, although they had the hog killing and they had much meat, there were stores in that community. One of the one of the grocery stores that we call, one of the grocery stores was owned by a black man who was a member of the Methodist Church. Then there were two different Jewish sect churches on McDaniel Street. And one of the sects was Great Savior. The Tenenbaums owned that. And then the other one was the Rogers grocery store. And the Rogers grocery store was more kosher meats and things. And Great Savior had most of the, I guess what you call soul food, but we didn't call it soul food at that time. We just called it good food. Okay. But anyway, we had that right in the same block, like 1, 2, 3 streets below Smith Street. Okay. And next to Great Saving was a house, a residence up some steps. And it was really on top of Great Saving. Some people lived there. And down the street from that was a barbershop. It was owned by a black man who attended Area Born Methodist Church.
Was your family Methodist?
My family, my great grandmother and father, they were Methodists. Okay, and I attended the Methodist church with them until I was about 9 or 10. Well, say about 5 years, because most of my parents were in college when I was born. And in 1942, World War II broke out. So my dad, who at that time was a student at Morehouse College, the black guys were volunteering for what they called the draft. Because if you volunteered for the draft, as far as I understood, you could get the other 2 years of your college paid for by the government. All right, so we lived. I was born at 966 Smith Street, and then we stayed at 966 Smith Street until my dad went to join the military, and then we moved. We moved to Fort Benning, right outside of Fort Benning is where they housed the sergeants and lieutenants, and they were little shotgun houses where you could stand in the front yard and shoot a bullet through the front door, and you could. That's what they call the shotgun house. But anyhow, we lived there in Fort Benning.
Was it a happy move?
It was happy. Okay. It was happy. It was adventurous. Okay. Both my sister Doris was born in the house on Smith Street. Okay. My sister Jimmy was born in the house on Smith Street. So my sister Jimmy was 7 years younger than I. Okay. and my sister Doris was 18 months younger than I.
Okay.
But we all, when it came time for us to go to Columbus, we were all old enough. Well, we all went with my dad and my mom. My mom was a college student uh, so, uh,
For,
uh, at Fort Valley,
yeah.
and so as life progressed and the war came, I remember the morning that the Sunday morning of the the bombing of Pearl Harbor, just listening to it on the radio with my family. Shortly after that, my dad went on. They went overseas. Okay. Well, with him going overseas, even it was not a sad time. It was just a time of they made it like a picnic day because the military families watched the convoy leave the Fort Benning Army base, and my dad was hanging out of the window of the truck he was on. He just looked happy, happy, happy. So with that came real turmoil for my family.
Okay.
Uh, my mom was a single child, a very attractive single person, as I understand. Well, I thought she was pretty, but most people did too. Many people did too. So when my dad went overseas, and then of course, as things would happen, coming back and forth and going all these different places. When I was about 8 or 9, I think, uh, my dad and my mom were not getting along. My mother had never taken care of anything. It was always my great grandmother and my grandmother who were the homemakers. And my it wasn't working when he would come back and forth. And my great granddaddy, through the intervention of my grandmother's brother,
and grandmother's name is
Willie Mae,
Willie Mae.
but we called her Chuck. Her name was Willie Mae Idlet Nesbitt. A married name was Nesbitt. But the thing that I remember about the little shotgun house in Fort Benning, on the end of the porch was maybe about 4 by 6, 4. It ran the complete little house.
Yeah.
It was a single family house.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now at the end of that porch was this trellis that ran from the ceiling to the floor, and I would watch the lizards play on this floral trellis.
Okay.
And this a part of the lizards that sticks out down here, and it's red.
Yeah.
Well, I used to think that was a pretty stick. So I would watch that a lot. Okay. I remember that. I remembered. I started school in Columbus, first grade, and I remember that. I don't remember it clearly, but I remember it. I did go to school in Columbus, and I remember my paternal grandmother coming to stay with us for a while. I remembered parties that my parents would have with other military families. Okay. They had a good time.
They had a good time.
I remembered my dad teaching us the cadence, the march cadence. Oh. And that was an experience too. But with my dad going back and forth in the military, my grandmother's brother, he was a sports person, and he would be going back and forth with the Morehouse football team and the baseball team.
What was his name?
Arthur Leroy Idlet. His name was Arthur Leroy Idlet, but his nickname was Boy, and that was the name that we called him. And they nicknamed him Boy because they recognized the stigma of children, colored children, and I'm saying colored children at the time because we were called colored people at that time, and the being called boy, and that was demeaning. So they wanted to make sure he never would have to deal with being called boy
and feeling offended.
And that name stuck with him most of his life. If you knew him, though, you knew his name was Arthur Leroy Idley. And he was named Arthur because my great grandmother, Carrie Young Idley, had a brother, and his name was Arthur. And they had named Arthur Leroy after Arthur Young.
Okay.
Arthur Leroy Idley after Arthur Young.
Okay.
Now, who I remember as a very joyful
Arthur Leroy Idley?
Uncle Arthur. Young. He was
okay,
Young.
Okay.
My great grandmother's maiden name was Young.
Okay.
And she was born in Jacksonville, in Live Oak, Florida.
Okay.
Her dad's name was Jerry Young, and her mother's name was Alice Polite. That was her maiden name, Alice Polite. And my dad also grew up in the Pittsburgh community, one street over from where my mother grew up. Okay, so I knew my paternal grandmother. I did not know my paternal grandfather because he died, I guess, about a month before I was born. And this is an interesting story that they tell me about him. James Ellison, that's my dad's father, his James Monroe Ellison Sr., was a policy man that they call a policy man at that time. He went door to door selling life insurance in the black community. And he was married to Pearl House. House was her maiden name. Well, they lived in a house which was the next street over in the upper block. Well, in the block going toward University Avenue, and that house is still standing.
Oh wow!
That house is still standing, and
in 2024.
In 2024. But the as I was going to say about I didn't know him, but when there was a field that ran from our street to Garibaldi Street, where that house was, where my granddad would walk through to get home, so he didn't have to go all the way down the different streets. So, but my mom used to tell me about when I was a little person, when I was a baby and just learning to talk, she'd have me on her shoulder, and I'd be looking over her shoulder, looking back. And she said, I always, whenever she took me across that field, she said, I would always say, look at that man. And they concluded that it was my granddaddy's spirit.
Wow.
Now, I have never seen him, but I have a warm feeling that if I ever did see him, I would know him. But anyway, my paternal grandmother, he didn't live long, but they had a lot of children. They had more than 13 children, boys and girls, and the boys were impressive physically, and their physical selves, and in their booming voices.
Oh, I love a good voice.
And one of my uncles, my uncles, I didn't have any maternal aunts and uncles, birth ones. But one of my uncles was Henry Curtis Ellison, who actually sang with the Boston Symphony in that time of life. Okay, as I got to be a teenager in high school, and he and his wife sang with that with the Boston Symphony. They had beautiful voices.
Okay.
They really had, they didn't have any children either. I had an uncle named Forrest uh, Ellison, an uncle named uh, Napoleon Bonaparte Ellison.
Oh, wow.
And he was a an imposing figure.
Okay.
And he had a booming voice and he liked to laugh. All of them laughed very similarly, even the girls. But the male voices, it was like these were booming voices. And you knew when an Ellison was on the street and when he was laughing.
Oh, wow.
Um,
That's a good thing to have.
it really, but anyway, that I remember those. I remember my aunt. Uh, we called her Boot. Her name was Audrey May, but we called her Boot. Uh, I remember my aunt Bill. Her name was Wilhelmina, but the nickname was Bill. And I remembered my aunt Lavone. She had a beautiful voice. She had one son, and her son, she lost her son. Uh, he went to New York for a visit to some relatives when he was a teenager, and he died in New York from some kind of accident. But um, I said all of this so you could know I knew many sides of my family, and this is my mom's parents, Willie Mae that we call Chuck, Mama Chuck, and my great grand and my dad, my granddaddy, who was my mom's dad, who was Mitchell Nesbitt. I knew his mom. I knew my great grandmother on my granddaddy's, my maternal grandmother, my mother's side, and the wonderful little lady. Her name was Mattie Nesbitt, and they called her Matt. But she was a fiery little lady, and she had she had at least 10 children. They also lived in a house in Pittsburgh on West Avenue. They also, anybody who needed a place to sleep to lay their heads, if my grandparents on either side knew that if they could help, they would help them. And I also remember that side of my part of my family. They had a very unique way of laughing too, and I can remember my mother laughing so that she said, she had a little sound like that when she laughed. It was just something. It was something about them. But anyhow, getting back to growing up in the Methodist Church, area Boone, living in my great grandparents' house, and as time would go, my great grandparents built a house immediately behind the house at 966 Smith Street. It was at 965 Irish Street.
Okay. Your great grandfather built a house on the back of Smith Street.
Both of their backs
came to next to it, against each other.
This was the block. No, they didn't come near each other.
Oh.
There was a garden in between, and and the place where they killed the hogs and everything. Okay. But it was the other side of the property.
Okay.
But anyhow, not only did my great granddaddy build that house on Irish Street, which had indoor plumbing.
So by that point, we had gotten indoor plumbing.
We had gotten indoor plumbing.
Okay.
Well, we also got plumbing on Smith Street because my granddaddy built a bathroom on the back porch on Smith Street and then tied on to the city plumbing. So we did eventually have city plumbing at Smith Street. And I remember.
And prior to the plumbing, we would use the restroom.
You used a slop jar. They called them slop jar.
And each person had one, or you had one for the house?
You had the one that the grandfather was going to empty on the morning after. And You know, so it was the waste that the family had.
So it would be in a room somewhere?
Yeah, in a little special place where
Okay.
you could have a little
Privacy. Okay.
But it was a chrome, not chrome, but a metal pot, but it had whatever the covering was. They had different colors. They had blue spackle ones, white cover, and a little top, little cute little top that fit over it. Some people had them what you see now in many senior citizens' homes as a portable bathroom. Well, that was known many years before that.
Okay.
But most people just had a little slop job. The children and the children did have their own little cute little pot.
Okay.
Because children would, after they had been cleaned out, you could see children playing with their pots, carrying them around. But anyhow, it was all we didn't I didn't get the feeling of depression. I was happy. I was sad because of the situation between my own parents.
Which was that they broke up.
They separated, and my dad eventually married again, and I have sisters by that marriage. I had 3 living sisters by that marriage at this time, and their children are the ages of my children. uh, Born same years as my children, but they're all girls.
Okay.
And they are alive. Now my sister Dorothy, that we call Doris, that was 18 months younger than I. She died this year. She died last year.
2023.
She died the end of September. And my youngest sister Jimmy died in 2024. I mean 2022.
Of COVID, right?
Of COVID. Of COVID. Doris didn't have COVID, but Doris seemed to me to be an Alzheimer product and heart problem. Uh, the
But you said it was a happy time. I mean, you had a happy childhood, you would say.
I had a delightful childhood because of the stability of my great grandparents on both sides of my family and my grandparents on both sides of my family. And I knew them, and I, I had an adventurous time with them. Now, my dad's mom, after my granddaddy died, she was one of the first tenants of public housing, University John Hope. University John Hope Homes on Fair Street. And that wall, there was a wall where you could go up each side of the steps within this wall to go up to the play area, the lawn area. It still stands over there. Okay. And some of those units are still standing that surrounded that playground. But my great grandparents in Pittsburgh, always cooperated the families cooperated. You knew how each other felt about each other, different issues, but they cooperated when it came to maintaining a visitation, a contact with all of us. Well, I love to go to University John Hope Homes, even though it was crowded. But the children could play outside in the garden that was on each side. Oh, they called it though. It was another name they called it. But it had swings. It had places, a little area where you could really just play little ball games and you could shoot marbles. They had concrete stoops on each of the apartments, and they had supervision. They taught those young mothers to cook, to clean. There were standards that you had to have in order to move, standards of behavior that you had in order to qualify, and you had to be a single mother. And although it was misused down the line because they started playing the game of the men coming in after the folk would get off the whose Atlanta Housing Authority people would go home. But
So they were actually living there, but they couldn't report that they were living there, or they wouldn't qualify.
they wouldn't qualify. However, it was really in the beginning. It was an experiment in assisting single mothers. But they at that time the dads would have been deceased, but then it came over to assisting single mothers whose children's fathers were living, and then it became a situation where instead of being straight up and changing the qualifications for living low income people, well, the anybody started living in public housing, and it became a messy situation. Now in Atlanta, the Techwood Homes was the first public housing unit, and it was for white people.
And are we talking about segregation? It was for white people?
We're talking segregation. It was for white people. University Yard Hope on the side, but north, but Stewart Avenue, not Stewart Avenue. Um, well, it became Northside Drive, but that was for the black people, for the colored people, for the colored people. And you hear me saying black people, and well, when I was born on my birth certificate. It said I was a Negro, and my parents were colored. No,
Really, Grandma?
but you see the political movement
Yes.
of this segregation anyway. Anyhow, I loved and I'm very grateful for having grew up in the community called Pittsburgh. I attended the elementary school, which sits the front part of W.H. Crogman Elementary School, is still standing. It faces West Avenue on one side where there's classrooms and play space, which faces Fletcher Street. The other side of the school playground covers Roy Street. I think that's Roy Street. And then at the time that I was in school, the school grounds went all the way down to McDaniel Street. Now, Parks Middle School, I believe. It's either elementary or middle school sits in in a space behind W.H. Crogman Elementary School. So it's a Parks Middle School. Uh, my youngest sister attended W.H. Crogman Elementary School, and she went to no she Parks Middle School. I mean not Parks Middle School, but Price High School, which was on the University Prior Street side for black people. It was also connected to an old community of black people, of colored people, called High Point. And the Pri- Price High School, I think, still is operating over there, and the High Point apartments across the street from the public housing units that they built. But the High Point apartments were supposed to be a step up for the young people who were graduating from college and had families. And many of Atlanta people, including myself and my husband, Glenn Dansby, lived in them as a stepping stone to becoming a property owner. Many things about Pittsburgh are very, very encouraging because of the determination of the colored people to be the best that they can be in helping their family to achieve a quality life experience. And in the community of Pittsburgh, between University and the railroad street, railroad uh, shop, the changeover point for Southern Railroad, that railroad came across the street, across McDaniel Street, and that was probably not the legal boundary for Pittsburgh, but the common boundary that we called it. It was where Mechanicsville was on the west side, and Pittsburgh was on the east side.
And you said something about Mechanicsville being named after
Many of the mechanics who worked at Southern Railroad there.
Southern Railroad Company.
Southern Railroad Company. It was a big factory there. It was a shop, and that's where the trains would come in to be serviced. And many of those men their families, they lived right there in Mechanicsville. So all they had to do was walk over to do work. And that shop, I think, is still over there. I need to go and check that out. But I think the shop is there because not only that shop blocked Prior Street, well, the roads leading to blocked Prior Street. The parameters for Pittsburgh were University on one side, the railroad of the going west, Stewart Avenue, on the other side, and Prior Street on the other. That was the geographical area that I knew. If you were, as a girl child, we knew never to go beyond University without our parents on one side, or to go across Pride. Now the boys can tell a different story because the boys did move a little differently than the girls. And
was crime a problem in Pittsburgh? Do you remember?
Racism was a problem, and crime was a problem. No, okay.
Okay, hold that thought. I'm gonna pause for the calls. Thank you, God, for giving me